She thought my solar panels were her free charging station until I cranked the voltage and watched her Tesla meltdown. Karen kept stealing electricity from my solar grid for her Tesla, so I set a trap that fried her. Right in front of the whole neighborhood, she plugged her Tesla into my solar outlet every single day without asking. And when I finally flipped the switch, she never recovered. Karen claimed my solar power was community property, but after I set the voltage to max, her Tesla told a very different story. She thought she could outsmart me, the HOA, and even the police, but one surge from my solar system ended Karen's reign for good. The strange spike in power in the heart of a neatly organized suburban neighborhood, where lawns were evenly trimmed, hedges stood in perfect symmetry, and the HOA prided itself on maintaining order. One homeowner noticed something peculiar. His name was Daniel, a quiet, meticulous man who had spent years working in renewable energy. His pride and joy wasn't just his immaculate two-story home, but the solar grid he had installed on his property, a state-of-the-art system designed to generate enough power for his household and store extra energy in a sleek battery setup. To Daniel, it was more than just technology. It was independence. It was the result of years of careful planning and investment. But then, one month, his power bill told a different story. Despite his solar panels generating more than enough energy to cover his daily needs, Daniel noticed a sudden, unexplained increase in usage. It wasn't massive at first, just a few extra kilowatt hours each day, but enough to make him pause. He double-checked his appliances, making sure nothing was left running unnecessarily. He inspected his solar system, certain that no error had occurred. Yet, the numbers didn't add up. Something or someone was drawing extra energy. The mystery grew when Daniel walked outside one late evening to check his system manually. As he rounded the corner of his driveway, he froze. There, plugged into an outlet on the side of his house that connected directly to his solar battery, sat a white Tesla. Its polished frame reflected the glow of the streetlights, and standing nearby, holding her phone as if nothing was wrong, was none other than Karen, the neighbor everyone in the cul-de-sac knew too well. Karen was infamous for her antics. She complained about lawn decorations, reported neighbors for non-regulation mailboxes, and once tried to get a family fined because their dog barked too loudly. She was nosy, controlling, and entitled. But this was a new level. She had walked onto his property, plugged in her Tesla, and helped herself to his solar power as if it were community property. Daniel didn't confront her that night. Instead, he quietly unplugged the car after she left, shaking his head in disbelief. Maybe it was a what-I'm thing, he thought. Maybe she had just needed a quick charge in an emergency. But when he checked again the following night, the Tesla was back, and the night after that, it was becoming a pattern, one that explained the mysterious spike in his power usage. His patience wore thin, but he was cautious. He left polite notes on her windshield, explaining that the outlet was private property, not a community charging station. The notes disappeared, but the Tesla kept reappearing. Karen either ignored them or deliberately discarded them. It became clear she had no intention of stopping. In her mind, Daniel's solar grid wasn't his personal investment, it was free, green energy for her to take at will. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's frustration boiled. The extra energy draw wasn't just a nuisance, it was cutting into his stored reserves. His home systems, designed to be self-sufficient, were struggling under the uninvited strain of charging a luxury car he didn't own. He thought about confronting her directly, but anyone who had lived in the neighborhood long enough knew how that would go. Karen thrived on confrontation. She twisted facts, exaggerated her victimhood, and somehow always managed to make herself look like the aggrieved party. Daniel decided to bide his time. He documented every instance of the Tesla plugged into his outlet, taking photos and logging timestamps. He collected utility data that showed the unexplained spikes. Quietly, methodically, he built his case, because he knew, with someone like Karen, the truth wasn't enough, you needed proof. Then one morning, while reviewing his system logs, Daniel had a thought. His solar setup wasn't just advanced, it was customizable. He could adjust the voltage output, reroute energy, and even program responses to external draws. The system had safety features, of course, to prevent overloads, but he realized he had control over just how much power flowed through that particular outlet. The idea came slowly, almost as a joke at first. What if, instead of simply unplugging her car, he let it charge but on his terms? What if he adjusted the settings so that Karen's entitled little scheme backfired spectacularly? The thought lingered, grew, and eventually crystallized into a plan. But Daniel wasn't reckless. He wasn't going to do anything dangerous or damaging. What he envisioned was a harmless but powerful reminder, one that would expose Karen's audacity and force her to stop. If she wanted to siphon his power without asking, then she would feel what happened when he pushed his system to maximum output. For now, he continued to watch. The Tesla appeared almost like clockwork, usually late in the evening, when most neighbors had gone to bed. Karen thought she was clever, slipping into his driveway under cover of darkness. But Daniel saw everything, and as he fine-tuned his solar grid, preparing it for the inevitable confrontation, he realized something important. Karen thought she was untouchable, above the rules. But she had just made a mistake. She had chosen the wrong neighbor to steal from. And soon, she was going to learn exactly what that meant. Entitlement in broad daylight. By the end of the first week, Karen's pattern had become impossible to ignore. What began as quiet, late-night visits soon spilled into daytime hours. At first, she was careful, sneaking her Tesla into Daniel's driveway under the cover of dusk, slipping the charging cable into place like a thief who thought no one was watching. But as the days wore on and she faced no direct confrontation, her boldness grew. One Saturday morning, Daniel looked out his front window and nearly laughed at the audacity of it all. There was Karen, in broad daylight, sipping from a travel mug as if she were sunbathing in her own yard. Her Tesla sat humming quietly, plugged into his solar outlet. She hadn't even bothered to pretend it was an accident anymore. She leaned against the car, scrolling through her phone, utterly comfortable, as though his driveway were an extension of her own property. The sight boiled Daniel's blood, but it also solidified his resolve. Karen didn't see her actions as theft. She saw them as entitlement. In her mind, the neighborhood was hers to manage, his solar power was hers to use, and anyone who challenged her risked her wrath. And that was exactly why she felt confident, enough to park in plain view of every neighbor. The neighborhood, however, had noticed. Whispers began spreading across the cul-de-sac. Families walking their dogs slowed down to glance at the Tesla, shaking their heads. Children playing basketball in the street asked their parents why that lady always parks at Mr. Daniel's house. A few neighbors who already had a history with Karen chuckled under their breath, amused that she had finally found a new target. But as the whispers grew, so did Karen's arrogance. She strutted into HOA meetings with the same self-righteous energy she always carried. But now she added a new boast. She spoke of her commitment to green energy, bragging that she had exclusive access to one of the most efficient solar grids in the neighborhood. She painted it as some sort of mutual arrangement, a gesture of community spirit between her and Daniel. The irony was staggering. Daniel sat silently in the back row of one meeting, his jaw tight, as Karen claimed his solar energy like a badge of honor. Neighbors glanced his way, waiting for him to interject, but he said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Karen in public. She thrived on turning debates into spectacles, twisting the truth until it suited her narrative. For now, silence was his weapon. Silence, and the plan that grew stronger in his mind each day. Meanwhile, Karen's Tesla had become a fixture in his driveway. She came and went at will, sometimes leaving it for hours at a time. The extra draw on his solar grid became noticeable in his home lights dimmed slightly. During peak charging, his battery reserves drained faster than usual, and his carefully balanced system began to wobble under the pressure. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to remind him that she wasn't just stealing convenience. She was undermining years of work and investment. Daniel doubled down on his documentation. He installed discrete cameras facing the driveway, capturing high-definition footage of her plugging in. He logged every spike in energy, aligning it perfectly with timestamps of her visits. He saved screenshots of neighborhood chatter on social media, where people speculated about Karen's shamelessness. Piece by piece, He built a record so airtight that no HOA board, police officer, or legal authority could dismiss it. But as much as he wanted to file an official complaint, part of him wanted something more personal. Karen had spent years lording over the neighborhood, nitpicking and controlling, convinced she was above the rules. A mere fine wouldn't break that arrogance. He wanted her to feel the consequences in a way she couldn't twist or spin. And so, late one night, Daniel returned to his workshop. His solar system's control hub glowed softly in the dark, waiting for him. With a few keystrokes, he accessed the voltage settings for the outlet Karen always used. Normally, it delivered a steady, regulated flow, safe, reliable, efficient. But the system could handle more, much more. He adjusted the upper limit, recalibrating the surge protocols, making sure safeguards remained intact for his own appliances. What he was creating wasn't dangerous. It wouldn't fry her car or damage his system, but it would certainly get her attention. The thought of Karen smugly plugging in, only to watch her precious Tesla react in ways she couldn't explain, smile for the first time in weeks. He didn't see it as revenge. He saw it as justice. The next morning, the Tesla returned, just like clockwork. Karen strolled up Daniel's driveway with her charging cable in hand, not a care in the world. She plugged in, settled into the driver's seat, and started scrolling through her phone. She had no idea the outlet had been prepared for her arrival. As the sun climbed higher, the solar panels gathered energy, funneling it into the battery and then into her car. But this time, the flow was different, stronger, faster, more intense. The Tesla's dashboard flickered strangely, its charging system groaning under the unexpected surge. Karen frowned, glancing at the screen, confused by the unusual behavior. She tapped a few buttons, convinced it was some minor glitch, but the system didn't return to normal. Instead, it whined louder, the car reacting to the maximum push. Daniel had programmed. From his living room, Daniel watched the scene unfold on his camera feed. His arms were crossed, his expression calm, almost clinical. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment Karen would finally realize that her free ride came with a cost. And as the Tesla's charging port sparked faintly in protest, Karen's smug smile faded, confusion turned to panic, and, for the first time since this ordeal began, she looked like someone who had lost control. Karen runs to the HOA. The time Karen unplugged her Tesla that morning, her nerves were rattled. She paced in her driveway, staring at the dashboard readout like it had betrayed her. The charging process had gone haywire, flashing warnings she had never seen before. The car had beeped insistently, its screen displaying out voltage messages. That made her heart pound. For someone as image-obsessed as Karen, the thought of her gleaming white Tesla being damaged was unthinkable. It wasn't just a car to her, it was a status symbol, a crown jewel she flaunted in every conversation. She bragged about how eco-conscious she was, how sophisticated her lifestyle had become, how she was raising the bar for the neighborhood by owning such a vehicle. To admit that something was wrong with it was to admit a chink in her carefully crafted armor. But Karen had never been one to reflect inward. If something went wrong, she didn't ask what she had done, she asked who she could blame. And in her mind, there was only one answer: Daniel. By noon, she was storming into the HOA office, her heels clacking loudly against the polished floor. As if each step were meant to announce her anger, she slammed a stack of papers onto the counter, most of them printed screenshots from her Tesla app. The charging inconsistencies were highlighted in neon yellow, circled and underlined to dramatize the point. The HOA board members, already weary from years of her endless complaints about trivial matters, exchanged silent glances. They had endured her rants about mailbox paint, garbage bin placement, and lawn ornamentation. But now she was claiming that Daniel had sabotaged her Tesla by manipulating his solar system. She framed it as an act of harassment, spinning her story with theatrical flair. According to her, Daniel had agreed and spoken, but implied to let her use his solar outlet. She described it as a community benefit, something she had graciously brought attention to in meetings. And now, she claimed, he was punishing her for her environmental leadership by deliberately tampering with the voltage. It was, in her words, a targeted attack. The board members tried to remain neutral, But it was clear that her story had holes. For one, she had no evidence of permission. For another, Daniel was known for his meticulous, respectful nature. He wasn't the type to launch petty feuds. Still, the board couldn't ignore her completely. Karen had a way of wearing people down until they reluctantly took action, just to make her stop. That evening, Daniel received a letter slipped into his mailbox. It was written in the HOA's stiff, bureaucratic tone, requesting his presence at a special hearing regarding alleged misuse of property and harassment of a fellow homeowner. Daniel read it twice, his jaw tightening as he realized Karen had escalated the situation. But unlike most of his neighbors, Daniel wasn't intimidated by Karen's theatrics. He had his documentation, his camera footage, and his logs of energy usage. He was ready for this. If Karen wanted to drag the HOA into the mess, then she was about to find herself cornered. The hearing was set for the following week, and by the time the day arrived, word had spread through the neighborhood. The small meeting room was packed. Residents, eager for a front row seat to the drama, Karen arrived in her usual dramatic fashion, clutching her printed evidence and radiating self-importance. She made sure to loudly complain about the stress Daniel had caused her before the session even began, ensuring everyone heard her victim narrative. When the board called the meeting to order, Karen launched into her performance. She spoke of her Tesla, her commitment to sustainability, her supposed agreement with Daniel, and the sudden sabotage that had endangered her car. Her voice wavered in just the right places. Her eyes welled with crocodile tears, and her hands shook as she held up her stack of highlighted papers. To anyone unfamiliar with her history, it might have seemed compelling. But then it was Daniel's turn. He rose calmly, carrying a folder filled with documents and a small tablet for video playback. He began by outlining the facts. His solar system was private, installed at his expense, and not connected to any HOA-owned infrastructure. He explained the spikes in power usage, correlating them precisely with the timestamps of Karen's Tesla being plugged in. Then he played the footage from his camera's clear, irrefutable images of Karen walking into his driveway, plugging in her car without permission, and leaving it for hours. The room fell silent. Karen fidgeted in her chair, her face growing redder. By the second, she tried to interrupt, sputtering about unspoken agreements and neighborhood unity. But each time, Daniel calmly presented another piece of evidence. Every note he had left, every warning ignored, every incremental rise in his utility usage, it was all laid bare for the room to see. By the time he finished, the mood had shifted entirely. The neighbors who had once muttered uncertainly about the feud now whispered with clarity. They had seen the truth. Karen wasn't a victim. She was a thief. The HOA board, caught between their obligation to appear neutral and the undeniable weight of Daniel's evidence, issued a statement that Karen was not permitted to use his solar outlet under any circumstances. They stopped short of issuing a fine fearing Karen's inevitable appeals, but they made it clear that her actions were unacceptable and that Daniel had every right to protect his property. For most people, this would have been the end. For Karen, it was gasoline on the fire. She left the meeting fuming, her papers crumpled in her hands, muttering about conspiracies and favoritism. To her, the board's decision wasn't justice, it was betrayal. And if the HOA wouldn't punish Daniel, then she would find another way. That night, Daniel sat in his living room, sipping tea, reviewing his logs. He knew Karen wouldn't stop. He knew the battle wasn't over, and though the HOA had sided with him, he understood something deeper. Karen had just been humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, and humiliation was the one thing she could never forgive. Her next move wouldn't be cautious, it would be reckless, and Daniel was ready when the police came knocking. Karen didn't sleep much after the HOA hearing. Her humiliation gnawed at her like a wound she couldn't stop picking. Every time she replayed the meeting in her head, she heard the whispers, the stifled laughter, the looks exchanged between neighbors who were clearly delighted to see her knock down a peg. She convinced herself that the HOA board was corrupt, that Daniel had manipulated them with fake evidence, and that the entire neighborhood had turned against her out of jealousy. But Karen was not the type to retreat. When one door closed, she went barging through another, and so, less than a week later, Daniel found two uniformed officers standing at his front door. The knock had come just after dinner. Daniel opened it to find Karen standing behind the officers. Her arms crossed, her face smug once again. She had filed a report, accusing him of harassment and property tampering. She claimed he had deliberately damaged her Tesla, and she wanted the police to make him pay. The officers were professional, but cautious. They asked Daniel if they could speak with him, and he calmly invited them inside. Karen, of course, tried to follow, but one of the officers held up a hand and told her to wait outside. That didn't stop her from craning her neck, trying to eavesdrop through the doorway. Inside, Daniel kept his composure. He explained his solar system, showed the officers the control hub, and provided the same documentation he had presented to the HOA. He even pulled up his security footage, showing Karen walking into his driveway repeatedly without permission. The timestamps lined up perfectly with her Tesla's charging logs she had so proudly shoved in the HOA's face just days before. The officers exchanged glances, and Daniel could almost see the pieces clicking into place for them. They recognized what was really happening. Karen wasn't a victim, she was a trespasser. When the officers stepped back outside to speak with her, Karen's voice rose high enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. She accused Daniel of weaponizing his electricity, of endangering her safety, of conducting some sort of bizarre energy warfare. The absurdity of her claims drew a few neighbors to their windows, curious about the commotion. One officer eventually cut her off, telling her firmly that what she had been doing, plugging her car into Daniel's system without his consent, was unauthorized use of private property. They warned her that if she continued, she could face trespassing charges. The color drained from Karen's face as the officer said those words. For the first time, someone in authority had told her outright that she was in the wrong. She sputtered weakly about community sharing and understood agreements, but the officers weren't buying it. They gave her a final warning, then returned to their cruiser, leaving her standing in the driveway fuming. Daniel watched from his porch, sipping a glass of water, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The sight of Karen standing there, humiliated yet again, was enough of a victory. But if he thought the police visit would put an end to her antics, he underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. The very next day, she doubled down. If she couldn't win through the HOA or the police, she would try to win through sheer persistence. She parked her Tesla in his driveway again, bold as ever, and plugged it in like nothing had changed. Daniel was almost impressed. Almost. But instead of anger, he felt something else, resolve. This wasn't just about energy anymore. It was about boundaries, respect, and the principle of standing up to someone who thought the rules didn't apply to her. If Karen wanted a war, then she was going to get one, but it would be on his terms. He went back into his workshop, studying his system carefully. The little surge he had given her Tesla had rattled her, but it wasn't enough. She still thought she could intimidate him into backing down. So Daniel began drafting his next move, a way to escalate without ever breaking the law, a way to make her own arrogance backfire spectacularly outside. Karen leaned against her Tesla with that smug little smile, convinced she had regained control. She had no idea that the quiet man across the street was already preparing the next chapter of her downfall. And this time, she wouldn't just be rattled. She'd be exposed. Karen crosses the Lineth night after the police visit. The neighborhood seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Curtains stayed drawn, whispers died down, and most residents hoped the spectacle had finally reached its end. But Karen wasn't finished. Humiliation had festered into obsession, and obsession had hardened into reckless determination. To her, Daniel had embarrassed her 3 times over at the HOA, in front of the police, and now in the court of public opinion. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. People weren't avoiding her out of respect anymore. They were avoiding her to stifle their laughter. She couldn't let that stand. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Karen hatched a plan. If Daniel wanted to weaponize his solar power, then she would strike directly at the source. She would teach him a lesson by tampering with his system, show him that she could take back control. At 2 in the morning, while most of the street slept, Karen crept into Daniel's yard. Dressed in black with a flashlight tucked under her arm, she moved toward the side of the house where his solar hub was installed. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her anger drowned out her fear. In her mind, she wasn't committing a crime, she was reclaiming what she thought she was owed. What she didn't know was that Daniel had been expecting exactly this, after weeks of intrusion. After Karen's arrogance escalated with each failed attempt to dominate, Daniel had fortified his system. Motion sensors had been installed around the hub. Cameras had been angled to cover every blind spot, and a silent alarm was connected directly to his phone. So when Karen crouched beside the solar unit and reached for the panel, Daniel's phone buzzed on his nightstand. He was awake in an instant. Within seconds, he had pulled up the live feed on his tablet and saw her caught in the glow of infrared. Fumbling clumsily with the lock, Daniel didn't rush outside. He didn't need to. He tapped a button on his phone, activating the floodlights he had installed. The yard exploded into daylight, bathing Karen in blinding brightness. She froze, caught like a deer in headlights. A second later, a loudspeaker crackled to life. Daniel's voice, calm but firm, echoed across the lawn. He had pre-recorded it for just this occasion. "You are trespassing. This property is under surveillance. Leave immediately or the authorities will be called." Karen stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. For once, her face betrayed sheer panic. She glanced around wildly, realizing she had been exposed, realizing that Daniel had anticipated her every move. But it was already too late. Daniel had pressed another button on his phone, this one dialing the local police department. By the time Karen scrambled to her feet and darted back toward her own property, the sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. Neighbors stirred, porch lights flicked on, and doors cracked open as the drama unfolded before their eyes. When the cruiser pulled up, Karen was already in her driveway, frantically insisting that she had been checking for safety hazards. But the officers weren't buying it. They had the surveillance footage in hand. Daniel had forwarded it as soon as the alarm triggered. Clear, indisputable evidence showed her breaking into his yard and tampering with his equipment. This time, there would be no warning. The officers cited her for trespassing and attempted vandalism, handing her paperwork that made her face blanch. Pale, as they explained the consequences, neighbors stood on their lawns, arms folded, watching with thinly veiled satisfaction. The queen of the cul-de-sac had finally been dethroned. Daniel stood quietly at the edge of his porch, his arms crossed. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Karen's shrill protests, her pleas, and her sputtering excuses were all the spectacle anyone needed. By the time the police car pulled away, leaving Karen to retreat into her house, the neighborhood buzzed with a new energy. Text messages flew. Whispered conversations grew louder, and for the first time in years, people felt free to laugh openly at her downfall. But Daniel knew it wasn't truly over yet. Karen had been humiliated in front of the HOA, the police, the courts, and now, the entire neighborhood. That kind of embarrassment didn't fade quietly, it burned. And though she had been cited and shamed, Daniel suspected she would still try to salvage her pride. The only question now was how far she was willing to go before she finally broke. The final birthdays following Karen's late-night trespass carried a heavy silence. Curtains in her house stayed shut, her once constant HOA complaints stopped, and her driveway, where the Tesla had so often been displayed like a trophy, remained conspicuously empty. The neighborhood, though buzzing with gossip, almost felt lighter without her prowling around, issuing orders no one had asked for. But quiet was never Karen's natural state. Silence only meant she was plotting. For Daniel, life returned to something resembling normal. He checked his solar hub each morning, walked the perimeter of his property, and monitored the camera feeds. Yet beneath his calm, a part of him stayed tense. He knew her humiliation wasn't enough. Karen had built her entire identity on control, on dominance, and she would not surrender it without one last desperate swing. That swing came sooner than expected, on a Saturday afternoon. When most neighbors were out tending gardens or washing cars, Karen emerged, dressed impeccably, makeup flawless. She looked less like a woman defeated and more like one stepping onto a stage. At her side was her Tesla, freshly cleaned, gleaming in the sun as though no scratches or toes had ever touched it. She rolled it confidently down her driveway and stopped directly across from Daniel's house. Without hesitation, she climbed out, dragged the charging cable across the street, and plugged it into Daniel's solar outlet. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood. People froze mid-task, mouths open, unable to believe what they were seeing. After everything, the police, the HOA, the citations, Karen was doing it again. And this time, she wasn't sneaky. She was making it a show. For Karen, this was her last stand. In her mind, if she could reclaim Daniel's solar grid in broad daylight, in front of everyone, she could rewrite the narrative. She could claw back her authority, silence the whispers, and remind the neighborhood that she was still the force to be reckoned with. But Daniel had anticipated even this. He had upgraded his solar system after her attempted sabotage. The hub now contained a failsafe, an automatic surge protector that could redirect excess voltage into any unauthorized connection. It wouldn't damage his equipment, it wouldn't even risk his own house, but it would make any plugged-in device instantly regret crossing the line. So, when Karen smugly connected her Tesla, arms folded, waiting for Daniel to react, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. At first, nothing happened. The car's screen lit up, charging as normal. But then, a high-pitched whine filled the air. The Tesla's dashboard flickered wildly, lights flashing in rapid succession. The charging port buzzed as if alive. Within seconds, the vehicle's alarm blared, lights flashing, horn honking, systems spasming under the sudden surge of redirected current. The neighborhood erupted in laughter. Phones came out, cameras recorded, and the sound of Karen's prized Tesla shrieking in distress became the soundtrack of her downfall. She rushed toward the car, yanking the cable, fumbling with the latch, shouting in panic. Her perfect facade cracked as she realized what was happening. She had been outplayed once again. Daniel stood calmly on his porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't said a word, hadn't lifted a finger. His preparation, his patience, and his quiet resolve had done all the work for him. The Tesla sputtered, its systems locking down as a failsafe of their own kicked in. The alarm finally silenced, leaving behind only Karen's ragged breathing and the echoes of laughter rolling down the street. She looked around desperately, but there was no sympathy left. The neighbors who once tiptoed around her now laughed openly. Some even clapped. For Karen, the war was over. She yanked the plug free, tossed the cable back into her yard, and climbed into her disabled car. Without another word, she slammed the door, rolled up the windows, and sat frozen behind the glass. The image of the self-proclaimed HOA queen, trapped in her own failure, became the lasting memory the neighborhood would never forget. In the days that followed, Karen withdrew entirely. No more appearances at HOA meetings, no more patrols around the block, no more lectures about grass length or garbage cans. The Tesla disappeared for weeks, likely in a repair shop, and when it finally returned, it never again crossed onto Daniel's property. The neighborhood slowly healed. Neighbors who once feared her tyranny began chatting freely in their yards again. Children played without her looming presence, and the air felt lighter, freer. The community, for the first time in years, belonged to the people who lived there, not to Karen. As for Daniel, he finally had his peace. He hadn't sought to become the neighborhood's quiet hero, but his patience, his preparation, and his refusal to bend to entitlement had set a precedent. The message was clear. Boundaries mattered, and no one, not even the loudest voice in the room, could strip them away. Karen's name still lingered in conversations, usually followed by chuckles or a shake of the head, but she no longer held power. She had burned through it all: her credibility, her pride, and even her car's reputation, trying to prove she couldn't be beaten. And in doing so, she had written her own downfall. The battle for the solar grid was finished, and as the neighborhood settled back into its peaceful rhythm, everyone knew one truth above all: the age of Karen's control was over.